Paper, 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 paper. How do you choose the right photo paper? Peter Piper. When you first start printing, it can feel really overwhelming when you look at all of the different paper types. Sometimes it feels like there's more paper types than camera manufacturers, or even more paper types than potato chips. Did you know the average grocery store has over 250 million different kinds of potato chips? Yeah, that's a lie. But it feels that way. Oh, how do you pick the right one? One of the weird things about life is that if you actually limit yourself, it makes it a lot easier to make decisions. So, for example, if you're entering a Formula One race, you're not going to show up with a Toyota Corolla. Likewise, if you're going grocery shopping, you're not going to go there in a race car, right? So I focus only on fine art photo prints, and that eliminates 80% of the papers out there. And out of the remaining 20, there are 3 factors that I consider extremely important. I want to like how it looks and how it behaves. Can I accurately reproduce the images that my clients give me onto this paper? Or even better, can I elevate their images on this paper? That's a pigment printer. So it's an inkjet printer that uses pigment inks instead of dyes. So I need to make sure that the paper I use is a paper for pigment inks. A lot of P's today. Photo paper pigment inks. Speaking of P's, the second thing I worry about is permanence. Is it an archival paper? Is it gonna last? What kind of fiber is it made with? What's the base of the paper? What chemicals have been added to it, if any? And what weight is it? Typically you want an archival paper to be over 200 GSM, that's grams per square meter. It's the standard measurement for paperweights. That's too much information right now. Is it gonna last? What's it made out of? Does it have any chemicals? Is it heavy? I care about the permanence of the paper. And the last thing I care about, does the paper have industry respect? Galleries and art collectors prefer specific papers. And if you show up with another paper, they're gonna turn their nose up. You put all this work and this effort into the image, you don't wanna trip at the finish line. And I sure as hell don't wanna be the person to trip you. I have to make sure the papers that I use have earned the respect of the industry. Now that I knocked out the first 80% and went through the last 20%, there's only a handful of papers I had to choose from. You can understand why I just have 2 papers that I use for almost every single thing I print. But before we talk about those papers, let's nerd out a little bit about paper. Yeah. So original darkroom photo paper consisted basically of 2 levels. You have the base, and then on top you had a chemical emulsion layer. Inkjet paper is really not that different. There's a base, and then on top there is a porous receiving layer, a coating. That's what it's called. You can use uncoated paper, but the problem with that is that the ink tends to spread out. Like an old tattoo where everything's just kind of spread out. That's what happens if you don't use a coated paper. There used to be a lot of debate over what kind of coating is best for inkjet papers. Pretty much everybody now uses microporous or nanoporous. It's at a point now where it really doesn't affect your print quality as much as it used to. But what does affect your print quality, and it's specifically its permanence, is the base we use. So let's dive into that. Photo paper bases. So there are basically 2 types: RC-based paper, which it stands for resin coated, and then there is fiber-based, which we've kind of mentioned before. It's usually either wood pulp or cotton rag fiber. Resin-coated actually includes wood pulp fiber as well. What happens is that wood pulp paper is sandwiched between 2 layers of polyethylene. If polyethylene sounds familiar, that's because you see it almost every single day. It's the same plastic that's used in grocery bags and shampoo bottles and all of that kind of stuff. It's why when you get a drugstore photo print, it feels plasticky. Because it is. RC paper used to be really looked down on because it would degrade pretty rapidly. Now there have been a lot of advances, but there hasn't been the same level of research on RC papers as on photo rag paper. And so for that reason, I'm not going to risk the permanence of the prints that I'm giving to people on RC papers. The second reason why I don't use them is they're not as environmentally friendly as other fiber-based papers, especially cotton rag papers. I figure I use enough plastic anyway every single day. And the last thing is related to what I talked about in the beginning. Galleries they don't like them. It's not as much of a luxury experience. And so RC papers, that's 3 strikes, they're out. Most of the paper that you and I use every single day is wood pulp fiber paper. I'm reading this off of some wood pulp fiber paper right now. What's the difference between a fine art paper and something like newspaper? You might even notice that newspaper, like if you buy one in the morning, by the afternoon it started turning yellow, and if you find it a couple months later, it's definitely yellow. Well, what happened? Lignin. Papers are made mostly from two elements, cellulose and lignin. Lignin's a polymer. It's actually what keeps trees stable and allows them to grow tall. When you're talking about papers, if it has a lot of lignin, it's going to affect the paper in two ways. One, it's going to make the paper darker, and also it's going to make the paper more rigid. For example, craft paper, lots of lignin. Toilet paper, not a lot of lignin. So the way you get a fine art paper is you remove the lignin. If you really want to geek out, so I knew about lignin, but I didn't know the actual chemical process of why it darkened papers. It's pretty cool. It's not lignin actually, it's oxygen. As oxygen interacts with the lignin, it breaks the lignin down, and as the lignin is breaking down, it absorbs more light. And so because it's absorbing more light, the paper becomes darker. Let's get back. Well, one more thing for fun. Technically, you could stop all of this. You could just put it all in a vacuum sealed box or fill it with an inert gas, and then in theory you would stop aging forever, but that would be a really expensive way to preserve all of your prints. What do we do instead? If you want a bright white paper and you don't want to bleach it or add extra chemicals or put chalk and everything into it, you remove the lignin. And of course that process is expensive and difficult to do. If only there were a natural fiber that just by coincidence didn't have a lot of lignin in it. Cotton has high levels of alpha cellulose, which is the king of all cellulose. Super bright, great for pictures. This is cotton rag. And you'll notice it's really kind of bendy, even though it's a thick paper. And that's because the alpha cellulose fibers inside of the cotton are actually really long. And when you mash them up into a pulp, they start to interlace. And so you get this malleable, yet strong paper that's not brittle. And it actually holds up better over time because it's alpha cellulose, it's really bright. Another cool property of alpha cellulose is that it's insoluble, so it's going to stand up well against moisture. And the gallery scene has been obsessed with photo rag for a long time, just because historically, before we had all these chemical processes to remove lignin and create alpha cellulose or harvest alpha cellulose out of wood, really the only place you could get it was out of the cotton rag. But it is more expensive because of all of that. And it is treated like a premium product. So you can probably tell I'm a fan of cotton rag. But let's talk specifics. What paper do I use? I use two different kinds of paper from the same manufacturer. Oh no. Let's talk about the actual papers that I use. These are two papers. They're photo rag papers by Hahnemühle. And I love these papers. This is a photo rag Baryta, and this is a photo rag matte. As the name would suggest, it's matte. It's a heavy paper, 308 grams per square meter. So it's got a nice heft to it. And it's just got a really beautiful, nice texture. This is the Baryta. I love this paper. It's 315 grams per square meter. And as you can see, it has a slight sheen to it. It's not a high gloss paper, it's just kind of a nice little subtle luster or semi-gloss, whatever you want to call it. Like I've said earlier, I use these two papers for 90% of everything I print. They're museum grade archival papers. They're made with cotton rag. It's sustainably made, which is an added plus for me. And they look beautiful. Also, I like Hahnemühle as a company. They have been around for a long time, 430 years. And they only have about 200 employees, and they focus only on fine art paper. I just think that's cool. And they're also a really respected name. They are the first ones to make fine art inkjet papers. And it wasn't that long ago, 1999. The Baryta is actually very similar to a darkroom paper. They look just like silver gelatin prints, and that's because the way the paper works is on top of the cotton rag layer, there is a thin layer of barium sulfate, which gives Baryta its look and feel. And that's the same composition that was used to make silver gelatin prints. So you have the cotton rag paper, the barium sulfate, and then the inkjet coating. In darkroom prints, it was emulsion on top. But one thing that's even better that you couldn't do in the darkroom is you can actually make color photos with it. I just think it's really cool. And when people come to the shop, they're always surprised at how much they like this because they're afraid, like they hear it's a glossy paper. I wish I could just accurately show this. It's not really glossy. It's a nice sheen with a good texture. Look at that texture. So nice. Anyway, I gush about this paper all the time. It's my personal favorite. But the matte is not too shabby. And people really love matte. And when you know how to work it, it can look really, really good. So the dynamic range on this matte paper is not as wide as the dynamic range on the Baryta, but as you can see, you can still get some nice deep blacks on it. I did a few little tests about like the black point evaluation on these. The blacks kind of disappear here around like 6. This is the Baryta paper. And when you go to the matte paper, it's more around like 10 to 12. What I do to compensate for this is sometimes I'll pull the black point up so that way you still retain all of this information down here. So when you look at these two, they should have the same amount of information in them. It's just this paper can't go quite to as deep of a black, so I just lift those blacks up. The matte is really great for when you're like viewing things in person. The truth is when you put a frame over either of these, they're gonna look indistinguishable. But in person, the matte can feel really nice if you want to remove glare. It's also nice for images that are not high contrast. When you're working with something high contrast, I like to work with the Baryta. If you're working with something that's like pretty low contrast, the matte paper can be great. Also a very forgiving paper. So when you're printing large, maybe you don't have the file size to kind of like hold up at that large of a scale, the matte is a little more forgiving. Let me just show you a couple pictures in each of the papers so you can kind of see how they look and how they react, and then we'll wrap this thing up. There are a bunch of papers that I could have used. Really, it comes down to a paper that I knew and I could work with, something that was permanent and something that was respected. I turned to these hand mule papers, but you can go through the same process and pick papers that work for you. What's most important to me about these papers that I use is not the materials that they come from or even the fact that they're from Hahnemühle. What's most important is that I know them. These are two very different papers. You can notice how similar these prints actually are. That's because I have spent so much time with each of these papers learning the ins and outs and where does the black fall off and where do the highlights start and does one like lean towards the blues or, you know, just understanding these papers. And that's how I think you should be with all of your equipment. It's not necessarily just the camera you use or the film you use or what program you edit your photos in. It's really at the end of the day, your mastery over these things. So as you pick a photo paper, as you do any of this kind of stuff, I hope You remember that, keep your context. Yeah, my name is Mitch. I'm the printer here at Nice Art Prints. The two papers that I love more than any other photo papers are Hahnemühle Photorag Baryta and the Hahnemühle Photorag Matte. And that will do it for this video. I'm gonna get back to printing.